I was always taught to be strong, not just physically, but mentally too. A man must endure, my father used to say, and for most of my life, I did just that. But no lesson, no mantra, could have prepared me for what Ella, my wife, did to me. We met in our mid-20s, Ella, a whirlwind of charm and elegance, and me, a young entrepreneur on the rise. She had this magnetic energy, the kind that lit up rooms. Everyone adored her, including me. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. For 12 years, our life seemed perfect. My business flourished, turning a small startup into a global conglomerate worth billions. With success came the kind of lifestyle many dream about: luxury vacations, a sprawling estate, and everything Ella desired. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Cracks I never noticed because I trusted her completely. A few months ago, I started to feel like something was off. Ella was more distant, her laughter less genuine. She spent late nights on her phone, brushing off my questions with vague excuses about helping a friend. I didn't push. Trust was the foundation of our marriage, and I refused to be the overbearing husband. Maybe I was naive. Then came the night that changed everything. Ella stood in our kitchen, wearing a dress I'd never seen before, a stunning emerald green gown. Her hair was perfect, her makeup meticulous. "I'm going to a charity event," she said, barely looking at me as she adjusted an earring. "Another one?" I asked, trying to hide my unease. Lately, she'd been attending more of these events without me. "Yes, Daniel," she snapped. "Not everything revolves around you. Some of us have our own lives." I swallowed my frustration and nodded, letting her leave without another word. But something gnawed at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. It wasn't jealousy, it was fear. An hour later, I sat in my study, staring blankly at spreadsheets that refused to hold my attention. That's when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You deserve to know the truth. Ella is with him tonight. The man she's been seeing." I froze. My chest tightened as I read the message over and over. For the next few hours, I pieced together the fragments of the life I thought I knew. Using a tracking app I'd forgotten Ella and I had set up for safety, I located her in a hotel across town, not at a charity gala. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, my world crumbling. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I waited. At 3 a.m., she returned, her makeup smudged, her heels in her hand. "The event ran late," she said with a yawn, walking past me toward the bedroom. "Was it worth it?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She stopped in her tracks. "What are you talking about?" "You and whoever you were with tonight," I replied, holding up my phone with her location on display. For the first time in our marriage, Ella didn't have a response. Her silence spoke volumes. "How long?" I demanded. "How long have you been lying to me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't care. I wanted the truth, not her sorrow. Finally, she whispered, 6 months. 6 months. Half a year of betrayal while I remained oblivious. My mind raced, replaying every moment we'd shared in that time, tainted now by the knowledge of her infidelity. But what came next shattered me completely. She confessed that the affair wasn't born from love or passion. It was a deal. Her lover, a tech tycoon, had offered her $100 million to leave me. "It wasn't about the money," she insisted, as if that made it better. "I was trapped, Daniel. I needed to feel alive." Her words hit like daggers. After everything I'd done for her, every sacrifice, she'd sold me out. Sold us out. As she spoke, all I could think was, how could I have been so blind? I didn't yell. I didn't throw things or demand answers. I just stood there, numb, as Ella tried to explain away what she'd done. Her words were empty, hollow echoes bouncing off the walls of my shattered trust. "It wasn't like that," she pleaded. "He approached me. He offered something I couldn't ignore." I stared at her, incredulous. "You're telling me you traded our life, our marriage, for a deal? For a bank transfer?" My voice cracked, betraying the fury I struggled to contain. "It wasn't just about the money," she cried, tears streaming down her face now. "You don't understand, Daniel. You're so busy with your work, your empire." I felt invisible. Invisible? I repeated, the word foreign and bitter on my tongue. You were the center of my world, Ella. Everything I did, every late night, every deal, was for us. For you. And you felt invisible? I'm sorry, she whispered, collapsing onto the couch. I was lonely, and he made me feel wanted. Wanted. The word stabbed deeper than I expected. All the times I'd held her close, told her she was everything to me, it hadn't been enough. In her mind, I wasn't enough. But it wasn't just loneliness that drove her, was it? And the $100 million? I asked, my voice icy. What's your excuse for that? She looked away, unable to meet my gaze. He said he'd take care of me if I left you. He promised I'd never have to depend on anyone again. A deal. A business transaction cloaked in the guise of an affair. It wasn't just betrayal. It was calculated, premeditated. She hadn't simply cheated on me. She'd negotiated the terms of my humiliation. I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, had become a stranger in a single night. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I wasn't ready to make any decisions yet, but I needed to know my options. We'd signed a prenup years ago, back when I was just starting out. At the time, it had felt like a formality, something my advisors insisted on. Now, it felt like my only lifeline. You're protected, my lawyer assured me. Your business, your assets, everything you built before the marriage stays yours. But if she fights, it could get ugly. Ugly. The word lingered in the air like a storm cloud. I wasn't afraid of a fight. I'd built my career on battles far more vicious than this. But the thought of dragging our private hell into the public eye, it made my stomach churn. Later that day, Ella tried to talk to me again. She wanted forgiveness. She wanted to make it work. But I couldn't hear her over the roar of my own thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him, plotting our downfall like some twisted conspiracy. That night, I made a decision. If she wanted out, she could have it. But she wouldn't take another dime of mine in the process. The following weeks were a blur of meetings and maneuvers. I quietly began restructuring my finances, moving assets into trusts and shell companies that would be untouchable in a divorce. I hired a private investigator to dig into her lover's background. If this tech tycoon thought he could waltz into my life and destroy it, he was sorely mistaken. The investigator's report came back within days. His name was Marcus Bell, a Silicon Valley magnate with a reputation for reckless gambles and a penchant for destroying his rivals. He was flashy, arrogant, and deep in debt. A far cry from the suave, invincible figure Ella described. And then there was the bombshell. Marcus's company was on the brink of collapse. The $100 million offer wasn't a gift. It was bait. A way to gain access to me, my network, my resources. Ella hadn't just betrayed me. She'd been used as a pawn in someone else's game. When I confronted her with the information, she was speechless. For once, her silver tongue failed her. I didn't know, she stammered, tears streaming down her face. I swear, Daniel, I didn't know. Maybe you didn't, I said, my voice cold and detached. But you still chose him. You chose him over us. As I walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing on the floor, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to make them pay. For Ella, for Marcus, for every lie and betrayal. I would do what I did best. Strategize, outmaneuver, and win. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of my next move. If I had learned anything from my years in business, it was this: never act in haste. Let your anger burn if it must. But when it's time to act, your decisions must be calculated and cold. Ella and Marcus had underestimated me. I wasn't just a husband blindsided by betrayal. I was a strategist, a tactician, and I had built an empire from nothing. If they wanted a war, I would give them one. I started by ensuring that my personal and professional empires were untouchable. My legal team worked around the clock, restructuring assets, severing joint accounts, and isolating every piece of wealth and power that could be targeted. By the time I was done, there wouldn't be a single crack in my armor. Meanwhile, the private investigator I'd hired delved deeper into Marcus Bell's world. What he uncovered was worse than I imagined. Marcus's company wasn't just on the brink of collapse. It was teetering on the edge of scandal. Fraudulent contracts, unpaid debts, and a history of failed ventures all pointed to one thing. Marcus wasn't a genius entrepreneur. He was a con artist, holding his crumbling empire together with borrowed money and borrowed time. It was the leverage I needed. I waited until Ella left the house one evening, under the pretense of visiting her sister. As soon as she was gone, I unlocked the safe in my study and retrieved the folder my investigator had sent me. Inside were photos, emails, financial documents, and phone records, all painting a damning picture of Marcus's activities. I also found something I hadn't expected, evidence of their plan. Ella's affair wasn't just a betrayal of the heart. It was a coordinated attack. In several emails and texts, Marcus had outlined how they could manipulate me, bleed me dry, and then leave me with nothing. The plan had been in motion for months, and Ella had been an active participant. The betrayal hit me again, fresh and raw, but this time, it fueled me. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd show them what real warfare looked like. The first move was simple: expose Marcus's weakness. I fed key pieces of information to the media through anonymous channels. Rumors of fraud and mismanagement began circulating within days. His stock plummeted, investors fled, and creditors started calling. The cracks in his empire widened, and all I had to do was wait. My next move was directed at Ella. While Marcus fought to keep his company afloat, I confronted her with the evidence of their plot. I laid out every detail: their emails, their plans, their lies, and watched the color drain from her face. "How could you?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. "After everything we built together, after everything I did for you, how could you sink this low?" Her lips quivered, but no words came out. For once, she had nothing to say. "This isn't just about us anymore," I continued. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed yourself. And now, you're going to deal with the consequences." The fallout came faster than even I anticipated. Marcus's company collapsed within weeks, and his creditors came for everything he had. He tried to salvage what little he could, but my quiet nudges to the right people ensured that no one would trust him again. As for Ella, she found herself alone, ostracized by her friends and family, her reputation in shambles. The $100 million she had been promised? It disappeared along with Marcus's fortune, leaving her with nothing but regret. She begged me for forgiveness, swore she had been manipulated, claimed she never wanted things to go this far. But I couldn't bring myself to care. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. "I'll give you one thing," I told her as I handed her the divorce papers. "You always said I didn't pay enough attention to you. Well, I'm paying attention now." As I left the house for the last time, I didn't look back. The war was over, and I had won. But this wasn't just about victory. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my strength. They thought they could break me. They thought I would crumble under the weight of betrayal. But all they did was awaken the fighter in me. The silence in the house was deafening after Ella left. For weeks, her absence was like a ghost lingering in the air. I hated her for what she did, but hate couldn't fill the void she left behind. This was the same house where we'd celebrated anniversaries, made plans, and built dreams. Now, it was nothing but a hollow monument to a life I didn't recognize anymore. I realized I had two choices: drown in my anger or rebuild. I chose the latter. The first step was reclaiming my routine. My days had always been structured around work, but now I made time for myself in ways I hadn't in years. Early morning runs replaced sleepless nights, the rhythmic pounding of my feet against the pavement clearing my head. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd neglected during my climb to success. These were the relationships that had been real, the people who had stood by me before the wealth, before the accolades, and they welcomed me back without hesitation. Therapy was another unexpected part of my rebuilding process. I wasn't sure about it at first. A man in my position, someone who had built an empire, admitting he needed help? It felt like weakness. But sitting in that room, talking through the betrayal and pain, I realized that strength wasn't about pretending I was unshakable. It was about acknowledging the cracks and finding a way to fill them. The sessions forced me to confront questions I'd avoided. Why had I missed the signs? Why had I let my relationship deteriorate to the point where Ella could justify what she did? The answers weren't easy, and some of them stung. I'd focused so much on providing that I'd forgotten to be present. That didn't excuse her choices, but it helped me understand the dynamics that had allowed them to unfold. While I worked on myself, my career became sharper than ever. The fire that Ella and Marcus had ignited didn't just burn. It refined me. I poured my energy into expanding my company, making bold moves I'd been hesitant to try before. Freed from distractions, I had clarity like never before. Within 6 months, we'd secured deals that took us to the forefront of international markets. My competitors didn't know what hit them, but it wasn't just about work. I started exploring passions I'd long ignored. Photography, something I'd dabbled in during college, became a weekly escape. Hiking trails I'd once dismissed as too time-consuming offered solace. With every new experience, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under years of compromise. The pivotal moment came when I looked at myself in the mirror one morning and barely recognized the man staring back. Not because I was broken, but because I was stronger, leaner, and more determined than ever. Ella's betrayal didn't destroy me. It transformed me. Rebuilding wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And with every brick I placed, I knew I was building something no one could ever take away. 6 months into rebuilding my life, I thought I'd left the worst behind me. Ella was gone. Marcus was a ruin, and I'd risen from the ashes of betrayal stronger than ever. But life, as I've learned, has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It started with an envelope. A crisp white envelope with no return address slid discreetly under my office door. My assistant, Sandra, found it during her morning rounds. "Thought it looked suspicious," she said, handing it to me. Suspicious was an understatement. Inside was a single sheet of paper, but its contents hit harder than any confrontation I'd had with Ella or Marcus. It was a bank statement showing a $50 million transfer made from Marcus Bell's offshore account to Ella's personal account, dated 2 months before the affair came to light. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake, some kind of prank. But the more I studied it, the more the implications sank in. Ella hadn't just been a pawn in Marcus's scheme. She profited from it. She wasn't the manipulated victim she'd claimed to be. She'd been an accomplice, and half the payout was sitting in her account. The anger I thought I'd buried flared to life. I felt the betrayal all over again, fresh and raw. But anger without a plan is wasted energy. So, I did what I do best, strategize. I immediately contacted my private investigator, the same one who had exposed Marcus's dirty dealings. Within days, he confirmed that Ella had liquidated most of the money and funneled it into hidden accounts scattered across the globe. She'd covered her tracks well, but not perfectly. There were traces: a luxury condo in Dubai, a boutique business in Paris operating under a pseudonym. She'd used the payout to start a new life, far from the fallout of her choices. What infuriated me most was the audacity. She hadn't just betrayed me. She was thriving on the back of her deceit. The woman who'd begged for forgiveness and claimed she was lost had been quietly rebuilding her empire, funded by Marcus's blood money. But fate had one more twist in store. As my investigator dug deeper, he uncovered something Marcus had left behind: a ledger detailing every transaction tied to his offshore accounts. Apparently, Marcus was as paranoid as he was greedy, keeping meticulous records in case his deals ever backfired. Ella's $50 million payout wasn't a secret. It was a documented agreement tied to Marcus's fraudulent activities. With this evidence, I saw a path forward. If Ella thought she could outsmart me, she was about to learn how wrong she was. I made 2 calls that day. The first was to my lawyer, instructing him to pursue every legal avenue to expose Ella's complicity in Marcus's schemes. The second was to a trusted media contact, ensuring that the truth would eventually see the light of day. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice and making sure Ella's new life crumbled as spectacularly as the one she'd left behind. The day the truth came out wasn't a planned event, it was an eruption. A carefully calculated eruption, orchestrated with precision. Once the evidence of Ella's $50 million payout was in my hands, I set the gears of her downfall into motion. It began with a lawsuit. My lawyer filed a civil case against her, accusing her of conspiring to defraud me and attempting to transfer marital assets under false pretenses. We didn't need to win immediately. The case itself was a weapon. Once filed, it became public record, and the media vultures swooped in. Headlines spread like wildfire. Scandal rocks power couple. Ella's secret millions uncovered. Reporters dug into the court documents, which conveniently contained excerpts from Marcus Bell's ledger. Soon, the story of her payout, the hidden accounts, and her luxury ventures abroad became the gossip du jour. But the court of public opinion was just the opening salvo. My investigator continued to trace the money trail, finding even more damning connections between Ella and Marcus's fraudulent schemes. By the time we presented this evidence to the authorities, the case wasn't just civil, it was criminal. Within weeks, Ella's accounts were frozen as the investigation widened. Her new condo in Dubai? Seized. Her boutique in Paris? Shuttered. The life she'd quietly built on stolen money began to collapse in real time. I heard about her first encounter with the authorities through a mutual acquaintance. She'd been at a high-end restaurant in New York when federal agents approached her, asking her to accompany them for questioning. Witnesses said she tried to maintain her composure, but the color drained from her face when they mentioned Marcus's name. Meanwhile, Marcus Bell wasn't faring much better. My earlier efforts to expose him had already left his company in ruins, but now he faced an avalanche of lawsuits and investigations. It turned out my lawsuit against Ella had inspired others. Investors he'd conned, creditors he'd lied to, and former employees he'd exploited were lining up to take him down. The poetic irony? Marcus and Ella were now tied together in the public's mind, their betrayal of me painted as a desperate, greedy conspiracy. Whatever sympathy she might have garnered was obliterated. The fallout wasn't just professional, it was personal. Friends who'd once sided with Ella after our divorce abandoned her. Family members who'd supported her were humiliated by her role in the scandal. She went from being envied to pitted to despised, all in a matter of weeks. And I watched it all unfold with a sense of cold satisfaction. I didn't gloat, nor did I reach out to her. There was no need. Her punishment wasn't mine to deliver. It was the natural consequence of her actions. I did, however, attend the first court hearing. Sitting in the back of the room, unnoticed, I watched as Ella took the stand. She looked small, defeated, a far cry from the confident, glamorous woman who once stood by my side. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. Justice wasn't about vengeance. It was about ensuring that the truth came out, and that those who tried to destroy me would face the full weight of their own choices. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Even though I sat in the back, away from the action, I could feel the weight of what was happening. Ella, dressed in a muted gray suit that seemed to shrink her presence, sat at the defendant's table. Her attorney leaned in close, whispering urgently, while the prosecutor stacked document after document on the table. The trial wasn't just about the money anymore. It had become a symbol, my final severing from the life we'd built together. I hadn't planned to attend, but something inside me needed to see it through. I needed to witness the end. Ella's attorney stood to address the court, attempting to paint her as a victim of Marcus Bell's manipulations. She was coerced, he argued, his tone measured, a pawn in a much larger game orchestrated by a man who preyed on her vulnerabilities. But the prosecutor was relentless. With every piece of evidence presented, emails, bank records, and even footage of her meeting Marcus in secret, the case against her grew ironclad. Ella's face betrayed her fear as her world unraveled, piece by piece. I told myself I didn't feel anything for her anymore, but watching her sit there, exposed and alone, stirred something I hadn't expected: pity. This was the same woman I'd once loved, the same woman I'd shared dreams with. Yet, she was a stranger now, consumed by greed and desperation. The testimony that followed only deepened the chasm between us. Witness after witness came forward, detailing how Ella had facilitated Marcus's schemes, helped him access confidential information, and even planned to siphon more money through offshore accounts. When her turn to speak came, the courtroom fell silent. She stood, trembling slightly, her hands clutching the edges of the podium. "I made mistakes," she began, her voice barely audible. "Terrible mistakes. But I never wanted to hurt Daniel. I leaned forward, my jaw tightening. This wasn't about me, and we both knew it. This was about the choices she made, choices she justified in the name of survival, ambition, or whatever narrative she constructed to excuse her actions. As the judge dismissed the court for the day, Ella glanced back, her eyes scanning the room. For a brief moment, our gazes met. I expected to feel anger, satisfaction, anything, but instead, I felt nothing. She had become a chapter I'd already closed. Walking out of the courthouse, I realized how much lighter I felt. For months, I'd carried the weight of her betrayal, the anger, the need for justice. But now, seeing her face the consequences, I understood something profound. I was free. Free from the pain, the resentment, and the person she'd become. This wasn't my burden anymore. The life I was building, the strength I'd found, belonged to me alone. As I stepped into the cool afternoon air, I didn't look back. Ella's story was hers to finish. Mine was just beginning. Walking out of that courthouse felt like I had closed the final door on the life I used to live. The coldness of the courtroom was replaced by the warmth of the sunlight, and for the first time in what felt like years, I felt like I could breathe. Ella's choices had led her to the path she was on, and while I didn't regret seeing justice served, I knew I couldn't linger in the shadows of her decisions anymore. My life was mine to reclaim. Rebuilding had been a process, but the promise of what lay ahead now felt more real than ever. The day after the hearing, I returned to work with a sharper focus than I'd had in years. My team noticed it too, the calm determination that replaced the cloud of distraction I'd carried for months. Projects I had put on hold were revisited with fresh energy, and I poured myself into new ventures that sparked excitement instead of obligation. One of those ventures came from an unexpected place. An old friend from college, James, reached out to me after reading about the trial in the news. We hadn't spoken in years, life and distance had taken their toll, but his email was warm and genuine. "I heard about what you've been through," he wrote. "If anyone can come out of this stronger, it's you." We met for coffee the following week, catching up on years of missed milestones. James had started a nonprofit aimed at sustainable housing developments, and as he described the work they were doing, I felt a spark of inspiration I hadn't expected. For years, my business had focused on luxury and high-end properties, spaces designed to impress. But this was work that could leave a legacy. By the end of the meeting, I'd committed to partnering with James's nonprofit, offering resources and expertise to help them expand. It was a decision born from instinct, but it felt right, as if my pain had finally paved the way for something meaningful. Beyond work, my personal life began to flourish in ways I hadn't anticipated. I took up sailing, something I'd always wanted to try but never found the time for. There was something liberating about being out on the open water, the wind carrying me toward horizons unbound by the weight of my past. I also started saying yes to invitations I used to dismiss: a dinner with friends, a weekend hiking trip, a charity gala. It was at one of those events that I met someone new. Her name was Sophie, and she was nothing like Ella. Where Ella had dazzled with charm and elegance, Sophie was quietly self-assured, with a wit that caught me off guard. Our first conversation was about the food at the event, both of us agreeing it was overpriced and underwhelming. But as the night went on, we found ourselves drawn into deeper topics, from travel to philosophy to the books we couldn't put down. By the end of the night, I hadn't just found someone intriguing. I'd found someone who made me feel alive again. The next morning, as I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, I realized how much had changed. I wasn't the same man who'd been blindsided by betrayal. I was stronger, freer, and finally ready to embrace the future. Meeting Sophie felt like an unexpected breeze on a scorching day. Unexpected, refreshing, and something I didn't realize I needed. After the gala, I couldn't stop replaying our conversation in my mind. Her laugh, soft but genuine, lingered in my thoughts long after I'd left the event. For the first time since my world crumbled, I felt a flicker of excitement for something beyond rebuilding my life. The next week, Sophie and I met for coffee. I had been cautious about relationships after Ella, and honestly, I hadn't intended for the meeting to feel like a date. But as we sat in the cozy corner of a cafe, talking about everything from her work in urban design to my new venture in sustainable housing. I realized how much I enjoyed her company. She was grounded in a way that made me feel safe, but not complacent. There was a spark in her, a zest for life that I hadn't seen in a long time. She challenged my ideas without being confrontational, and when she listened, it felt like she truly heard me. Over the next month, our coincidental meetups became intentional. We explored the city together, from art galleries to late-night food trucks. I found myself looking forward to the texts that lit up my phone and the comfortable ease of being around her. For the first time in years, I wasn't focused on winning, proving something, or protecting myself. I was simply enjoying life, and Sophie was becoming an integral part of it. One evening, as we strolled through a quiet park, Sophie turned to me with a look of quiet curiosity. "You don't talk much about your past," she said. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to unpack that part of my life with her. But something about Sophie's presence, her honesty, her lack of judgment, made me want to share. So, I told her. About Ella. About Marcus. About the betrayal that had almost broken me. She listened without interrupting, her expression a mix of empathy and quiet strength. When I finished, I braced myself for pity or worse, distance. Instead, she surprised me. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But you didn't just survive it. You rebuilt. That says a lot about who you are, Daniel." Her words stayed with me long after that night. They weren't the empty reassurances people had offered during my darkest days. They were rooted in understanding, in seeing who I had become rather than focusing on what I'd endured. As our connection deepened, I found myself wanting to build something more with Sophie, but fear lingered at the edges of my mind. Could I truly trust someone again? Could I risk letting someone in after what happened with Ella? Sophie seemed to sense my hesitation without my needing to say it. One evening, as we watched the sunset from a rooftop bar, she leaned in close and said, "You don't have to rush, Daniel. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together." Her patience, her steadiness, it was exactly what I needed. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that love, real love, might be possible again. Allowing myself to trust Sophie was like learning to walk again after an injury. Unsteady at first, every step requiring conscious effort. But with every shared laugh, every moment of unguarded honesty, I felt myself rebuilding something I thought was gone forever: faith and love. Sophie never pushed, never demanded. Instead, she created space for me to heal at my own pace. It wasn't just her patience, it was her presence. She was consistent, reliable, and so different from Ella that sometimes it felt like she was teaching me what a real partnership looked like. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. When Sophie had to cancel a date last minute for work, or spent too long texting on her phone, my mind would flash back to Ella's betrayals. I hated that those memories still had power over me, but I couldn't pretend they didn't. One evening, as we shared dinner at my place, Sophie noticed my distraction. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her tone gentle but direct. I hesitated before answering. "Sometimes I get stuck in my head," I admitted. "I think about the past, about trusting again." She set her fork down and leaned closer. "You don't have to apologize for that. I get it, Daniel. Trust takes time." Her words eased something in me. Sophie wasn't asking for perfection. She was just asking for me to try. And with her, trying felt worth it. As things with Sophie deepened, life had a way of throwing another curveball. One morning, while reviewing my emails, I saw an unexpected subject line: "Urgent Inquiry, Marcus Bell." I hesitated before opening it. The message was from an old acquaintance in the tech industry who had heard whispers that Marcus was trying to make a comeback. The email warned that Marcus had started a new venture overseas and was using a shadow network of investors to quietly rebuild. The anger I thought I'd buried surged back. Marcus had been the architect of so much pain, and the thought of him rising from the ashes while Ella and I faced the consequences of his schemes made my blood boil. But this time, I chose not to act alone. I contacted my lawyer and private investigator, laying out everything we'd learned about Marcus's fraudulent past. If he thought he could restart without consequences, I was determined to ensure the world knew exactly who he was. Weeks later, Marcus's name was back in the headlines. The exposé, backed by my evidence, revealed his fraudulent practices, tarnishing any chance of his new venture succeeding. But as satisfying as it was, the confrontation I didn't expect came from Ella. She reached out to me for the first time since the trial. Her message was simple: "We need to talk." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet. When I saw her, she was almost unrecognizable. The confident, glamorous woman I'd married was now subdued, her eyes heavy with regret. "I don't expect forgiveness," she began, "but I wanted you to know. I'm sorry. For everything." Her apology felt genuine, but it didn't erase the past. "I don't hate you, Ella," I said, "but I can't forget what you did, and I've moved on." For the first time, I saw tears in her eyes that didn't feel manipulative. "I'm glad you have," she said softly. "You deserve to be happy." With Marcus out of the picture and Ella's chapter finally closed, I allowed myself to embrace my new life fully. Sophie and I took things slow but steady, and I found myself more content than I'd been in years. My partnership with James's nonprofit flourished, too. We broke ground on our first sustainable housing project, and I was proud to see my resources creating something tangible, something good. Sophie joined me at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, her smile lighting up the day. As we stood together, watching families move into their new homes, I realized how far I'd come. Betrayal had shaped me, but it hadn't defined me. As Sophie and I grew closer, we began to dream about what the future could look like, together. For the first time, I let myself imagine something I hadn't dared since Ella: a family, a shared life built on trust and mutual respect. Sophie was more than my partner. She became my confidant, my compass. When doubts crept in, she was there to remind me that love didn't have to hurt. And with her, it never did. We started making plans: a trip to Greece, a renovation of my home, even the possibility of starting our own nonprofit to support urban renewal projects. Every step felt like reclaiming something I thought I'd lost. 5 years after the betrayal that had shattered my world, I found myself standing on the deck of a sailboat, the horizon stretching endlessly before me. Sophie stood beside me, her hand in mine, as the sun dipped low over the water. My life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was mine. The pain, the lessons, the rebuilding, it had all led me here. Betrayal had once felt like the end of everything, but now, it was just a chapter in a much larger story. As the wind filled the sails, carrying us forward, I looked at Sophie and smiled. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace.